People always think weddings are the beginning of a story, but sometimes they are the moment a life quietly ends. The chandelier light in the grand Bellevue Hall shimmered like frozen fire as Emily Carter stood at the altar, her hands folded so tightly in front of her ivory gown that her knuckles had turned pale beneath the lace gloves. To everyone watching, she looked perfect, graceful, composed, a bride stepping into the happiest day of her life. But inside, her breath came in shallow fragments she kept carefully hidden behind a practiced smile. The orchestra played softly, a melody meant to feel like forever, yet every note pressed heavier against her chest as if time itself had begun to slow. In the back of the room, Vincent Caldwell stood near a marble column, unnoticed by most guests, his 65-year-old frame still carrying the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades learning how to read danger before it spoke. He was not supposed to be here, not officially, not visibly, but something about the bride had drawn him in, a subtle wrongness no one else seemed willing to see. Emily's veil trembled slightly when she exhaled, and Vincent's eyes narrowed, not at her beauty, but at the strain beneath it, the almost imperceptible tremor in her posture that did not belong to joy. When the officiant asked the final question, the room leaned forward in collective anticipation, unaware that Vincent had already noticed the faint discoloration at Emily's wrist, carefully hidden beneath layers of makeup and lace, or the way she swayed just slightly too long between breaths. "I do," she said, her voice soft, rehearsed, but the words seemed to cost her more than anyone could understand. The moment it left her lips, her body faltered, like a string finally snapping after too much tension, and she collapsed before anyone could reach her. The sound of gasps filled the hall, chairs scraping against polished floors, panic blooming in waves, but Vincent moved first, not rushed, not panicked, just certain. He crossed the distance with deliberate steps, his presence cutting through the chaos as if silence obeyed him more than noise ever could. Kneeling beside her, he studied her face not as a bride, but as evidence of something unseen, something wrong. Her makeup was flawless, too flawless, layered in a way that suggested concealment rather than celebration, and beneath it he saw what others missed, exhaustion etched into her skin, a fragility that spoke of endurance rather than illness. "Clear the room," he said calmly, and though he was not the officiant, not family, not authority in any official sense, people obeyed as if refusing would be unthinkable. As guests were ushered away in confused whispers, Vincent placed 2 fingers gently at her wrist, checking her pulse with the precision of a man who had once learned survival in places where hesitation meant consequence. It was steady, but weak, as if her body had been carrying a burden too heavy for too long. When paramedics arrived, he did not move aside immediately. Instead, his gaze lingered on the faint imprint near her jawline, barely visible, almost artfully hidden beneath foundation, and something in his expression hardened, not anger yet, but recognition. Emily was lifted onto the stretcher, still unconscious, her veil slipping slightly to one side, like a broken promise, and Vincent followed without invitation, stepping into the ambulance as though the decision had already been made long before the doors closed. As the vehicle pulled away from the grand Bellevue Hall, leaving behind a wedding frozen in confusion, Vincent looked down at her still face and spoke quietly, though she could not hear him. "This isn't a wedding," he said, voice low and steady. "This is a cover story." And for the first time that evening, something in his expression suggested that whatever had brought him here was no accident at all. The sterile hum of hospital lights filled the private wing of St. Augustine Medical Center as Emily Carter was rushed through a corridor that smelled faintly of antiseptic and polished metal, her wedding veil now tangled and forgotten beneath the thin blanket placed over her. Vincent Caldwell walked beside the stretcher without speaking, his presence steady enough that even the medical staff adjusted their pace unconsciously, as if matching the rhythm of someone who expected control in every situation. A doctor in a pressed white coat began asking questions, But Vincent raised a hand slightly, not in aggression, but in quiet authority that made the words pause in midair. "Focus on her condition first," he said calmly, his voice carrying the kind of weight that did not need volume to be obeyed. Inside the examination room, Emily was transferred carefully onto a hospital bed, her breathing shallow but stable, her face still carrying the remnants of carefully applied makeup that now seemed less like preparation for celebration and more like an attempt to conceal something fragile underneath. Vincent stood near the window as medical monitors were attached, his eyes tracking every movement of the staff, not interfering, but observing with a precision that suggested he had seen situations like this before in places far removed from hospitals. "Her vital signs are stable, but she is severely exhausted," the doctor finally said after several moments of examination, glancing between the charts and the patient. "There are also signs of prolonged physical stress. We need full blood work to understand what is going on." Vincent nodded once, his expression unreadable, but his attention never left Emily's face. When the nurse gently adjusted the blanket, a faint bruise along Emily's shoulder became visible, partially concealed by foundation that had been applied too carefully, too deliberately, as if hiding the truth had become routine rather than emergency. Vincent's gaze narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with recognition, the kind that comes from years of understanding when something has been covered rather than healed. "How long has she been like this?" he asked quietly, though no one had given him authority to ask. The doctor hesitated before answering. "It is difficult to say without her medical history, but based on initial indicators, this is not a sudden event. It appears to be cumulative." Outside the room, hospital corridors remained busy, but inside, time seemed slower, heavier. Emily stirred slightly, her fingers moving against the sheet as if searching for something she could no longer name. Vincent stepped closer. For the first time since arriving, his movements measured, careful not to disturb the sterile quiet. "Emily," he said softly, though there was no response, only a faint shift in her breathing. A nurse approached with a clipboard, hesitating before speaking. "Sir, are you family?" she asked, uncertain. Vincent paused briefly, then replied, "Not yet." The answer was simple, but it carried a weight that lingered after the words were spoken. The nurse nodded and returned to her station, leaving the room in controlled silence broken only by the steady rhythm of medical monitors. Vincent remained where he was, watching the subtle rise and fall of Emily's chest, his thoughts hidden behind an expression that gave nothing away. Outside the glass walls of the room, the world continued to move, unaware of the quiet shift taking place inside. Something had been interrupted that evening, something far larger than a wedding, and Vincent Caldwell, for reasons he did not yet articulate, intended to understand exactly what had been concealed beneath the surface of the life she had been forced to present. The hospital room remained quiet, except for the steady rhythm of medical monitors, as Vincent Caldwell stood near the window, watching the city lights flicker beyond the glass, like distant signals from a world that did not concern itself with what was happening inside this room. Emily Carter lay still on the bed, her breathing more stable now, though still fragile enough to keep the attention of every medical professional who entered. A nurse adjusted the forward line carefully, while a doctor reviewed the first set of preliminary results on a digital tablet, his expression growing increasingly focused with each passing second. "Her condition is not caused by a single incident," the doctor finally said, lowering the device slightly as he addressed Vincent with cautious professionalism. "We are seeing indicators consistent with prolonged exhaustion, nutritional deficiency, and significant emotional stress. There is also evidence suggesting exposure to substances that may have contributed to her collapse, although we need more testing to confirm specifics." Vincent did not react immediately, but his eyes sharpened slightly, absorbing every detail without interruption. "Substances," he repeated quietly, not as a question, but as confirmation of a direction his thoughts were already moving toward. The doctor nodded carefully. Nothing immediately life-threatening in isolation, but combined, they have severely weakened her system. This did not happen overnight. Vincent turned his gaze back toward Emily, studying her face with a stillness that made it clear he was not simply listening to medical information anymore, but reconstructing a pattern that others had missed. The faint traces of makeup still remained despite the hospital staff's attempts to gently cleanse her skin, revealing uneven areas beneath where concealment had been intentional rather than cosmetic. He had noticed it earlier, but now, with the medical explanation reinforcing what his instincts already suggested, the details aligned into something far more structured. A few minutes later, a second physician entered the room carrying additional lab results, pausing briefly when he noticed Vincent still present. "We ran a full toxicology screen as a precaution," the doctor said, glancing between the chart and the patient. "There are no signs of acute poisoning, but there are markers indicating long-term physiological strain that could be influenced by external control factors such as medication mismanagement or chronic suppression of normal recovery patterns." The words were clinical, but they carried implications that hung heavily in the air. Vincent stepped slightly closer to the bed, not touching Emily, but lowering his voice as if speaking to someone who might still hear him beneath unconsciousness. "She was being managed," he said calmly. The doctor hesitated, then nodded in reluctant agreement. "That is one way to interpret the pattern, yes." Silence followed, broken only by the soft beep of monitors. Vincent reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a simple black phone, making a brief call without stepping out of the room. "I need everything available on Emily Carter's recent medical history, financial dependencies, and personal associations," he said evenly, pausing. "Only once. And I want it within the hour." He ended the call and returned the device to his pocket, his attention never leaving Emily. The nurse quietly observed from a distance, exchanging uncertain glances with the doctor, both of them aware that whatever presence had entered this room was not typical of a family member or concerned guest. Vincent finally spoke again, not to them, but to the quiet space above Emily. "Someone made sure you were running out of strength before today," he said softly, his voice steady but carrying a weight that did not belong to anger alone. Emily remained unconscious, unaware of the words being spoken near her, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Outside, the hospital continued its normal operations, but inside this private wing, a line had quietly been crossed, and Vincent Caldwell had already begun tracing it backward toward its origin. The city lights outside the hospital continued their slow pulse against the glass as Vincent Caldwell remained seated near Emily Carter's bedside, his presence quiet but unmoving, like a fixed point in a shifting world. The medical team had come and gone twice in the last hour, each visit bringing updated charts, new measurements, and increasingly careful language that avoided speculation but pointed in a single direction. Emily's condition remained stable, yet fragile enough that every statistic on the monitor felt temporary rather than reassuring. Vincent's phone vibrated once on the table beside him, and without looking away from Emily, he picked it up and read the message that had just arrived. It contained preliminary background data, fragments of her recent months assembled from financial records, pharmacy logs, and employment history. Nothing dramatic was written in the report, yet the pattern it revealed was unmistakable. Irregular prescription refills, unexplained medical visits, sudden drops in energy levels recorded in clinic notes that were not followed up, and repeated cancellations of independent consultations. Vincent set the phone down slowly, his expression unchanged, but something in his posture shifted slightly, as if a final piece of a larger structure had clicked into place. The door to the room opened again, and this time a different physician entered, carrying printed files instead of a tablet. He hesitated briefly before speaking, aware of Vincent's presence, but choosing professionalism over avoidance. "We have reviewed additional historical data," the doctor said, placing the documents on the counter. "There are patterns suggesting long-term external influence on her medical decisions. Not in an immediate clinical sense, but in terms of restricted access to consistent care and possible psychological pressure affecting her ability to seek help independently." Vincent finally turned his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without interrupting it. "Explain restricted access," he said evenly. The doctor adjusted his stance, clearly choosing his words with care. "She appears to have been guided through a controlled environment where her symptoms were normalized or minimized. Appointments were delayed or redirected. In several cases, second opinions were discouraged through non-medical means." The room grew quieter after that explanation, the weight of it settling into the sterile air. Emily moved slightly on the bed, a faint shift of her fingers against the sheet, but she did not wake. Vincent observed the movement for a moment, then returned his attention to the doctor. "Who had authority over her care decisions?" he asked. The doctor exhaled slowly. "Based on insurance records and emergency contacts, it appears her fiancé and his immediate family had primary control over scheduling and approvals." The word fiancé lingered in the air, clinical yet loaded with implication. Vincent did not respond immediately. Instead, he stood and walked slowly toward the window, looking down at the distant movement of traffic far below, each car a reminder of a world operating under assumptions he was now no longer willing to accept. When he finally spoke again, his voice was calm, but the clarity in it had changed. "I want a complete timeline of every medical event in the past 12 months, he said. "Every appointment, every prescription, every missed consultation. I want it reconstructed down to the day and hour." The doctor nodded, understanding the seriousness of the request without needing further explanation. As the physician left the room, Vincent returned to Emily's side. Her face was calmer now, though exhaustion still lingered in the faint tension of her features. He looked at her for a long moment, not with pity, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had seen systems of control before and understood how deeply they could embed themselves in ordinary lives. "You were not failing," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "You were being managed." Outside the hospital walls, the night continued without interruption, but inside that room, the direction of everything surrounding Emily Carter had already begun to change, even if she was still unaware of it. The quiet hum of the hospital room had begun to feel different now, as if the space itself had adjusted to the presence of Vincent Caldwell, who remained seated beside Emily Carter, with the stillness of someone who no longer considered what he was witnessing as medical uncertainty but as a structured pattern waiting to be dismantled. The night outside had deepened, city lights stretching across the glass like distant signals, while inside, the steady rhythm of monitors marked every fragile moment of Emily's recovery. Vincent's phone lit up again, this time with a complete preliminary report compiled by his network, built from layers of financial records, medical scheduling data, and administrative access logs that had been cross-referenced within the last 40 minutes. He read it once without expression, then a second time with slower attention, as if confirming that what he suspected was not interpretation but fact. Emily Carter's medical care over the past year had not simply been inconsistent. It had been filtered through a single controlling point of access tied directly to her fiancé, whose authorization had overridden independent medical recommendations on multiple occasions. Appointments had been rescheduled without her presence, prescriptions adjusted without her consultation, and follow-up evaluations quietly dismissed under administrative justification that did not align with standard medical protocol. Vincent placed the phone down carefully, his gaze shifting back to Emily, who remained unconscious but no longer looked as if she were drifting aimlessly between instability and rest. Instead, she looked as if her body had finally been allowed to pause after months of silent resistance. A nurse entered quietly to check her vitals, pausing briefly when she noticed Vincent still present. "Her condition is improving slowly," she said, glancing at the monitor. "She is responding to fluids and rest. If there are no complications, she should regain consciousness within several hours." Vincent nodded once, acknowledging the update without asking further questions. When the nurse left, he turned slightly toward the dim corner of the room and made another call, his voice low and precise. "I need confirmation of the fiancé's current location," he said. "And I need access to all financial transactions linked to Emily Carter over the past 12 months. Every single one." He listened briefly, then ended the call. The silence that followed was not empty, but deliberate. A few minutes later, Emily shifted faintly on the bed, her fingers curling slightly against the sheet as though trying to find stability in a place she could no longer fully recognize. Her eyes remained closed, but her breathing changed subtly, suggesting the first signs of returning awareness. Vincent noticed immediately, his attention narrowing as he leaned slightly forward. "Emily," he said softly, not as a command, but as an anchor. Her eyelids fluttered, slow and uncertain, as if the world beyond unconsciousness was resisting her return. The monitor beside her registered a slight increase in heart rate, not alarming, but responsive. Vincent remained still, allowing her time without intrusion. When her eyes finally opened partially, unfocused and disoriented, she did not speak. Instead, she looked around the room as if trying to understand where she was, and how she had arrived there. Her gaze eventually settled on Vincent, and for a brief moment, confusion replaced exhaustion. "You are safe," he said quietly, his voice steady and controlled. "You are in a hospital, and you are not where you were before." Emily did not respond immediately, her memory still fragmented. But something in his tone, calm and unforced, prevented panic from rising. Outside the room, hospital staff moved with increasing awareness that something unusual was unfolding in the private wing, though no one had yet articulated what that was. Vincent remained beside her as she slowly began to regain coherence, his attention not leaving her face. Whatever had been built around her life had already begun to fracture, and for the first time since the collapse, Emily Carter was no longer fully alone inside it. The first thing Emily Carter noticed was the sound of her own breathing, slow and uneven as if her body was relearning how to exist in a place that no longer felt familiar. Light pressed gently through her half-open eyes, sterile and white, until shapes began to form around her. A hospital ceiling. A steady rhythm beside her. A presence that did not move away when she tried to focus. She blinked once, then again, and the room slowly sharpened into reality. Vincent Caldwell sat near the edge of the chair beside her bed, not leaning forward, not invading space, but positioned in a way that made it clear he had not left since she last remembered. For a moment, she did not speak. Her thoughts moved slowly, like fragments of a dream trying to connect into something coherent. "Where am I?" she finally asked, her voice quiet and uncertain, as if she was not fully convinced it belonged to her. "You are in a private medical room at St. Augustine Medical Center," Vincent replied calmly. "You collapsed earlier today at your wedding ceremony. You have been here since then." The words took a moment to settle. Emily closed her eyes briefly, as if trying to retrieve the memory, and when she opened them again, confusion had turned into fragmented awareness. "My wedding?" she repeated softly, not as a question, but as if testing whether it still made sense. Vincent did not correct her, did not push her toward any conclusion. Instead, he reached toward the bedside table where a tablet lay and activated a simple display. "There are things you need to understand before you leave this room," he said evenly. Emily shifted slightly, her fingers curling into the hospital sheet. There was no fear in her expression yet, only disorientation and fatigue. Vincent handed her the tablet without forcing it into her grip. On the screen were medical summaries, appointment logs, and financial records arranged in a clean, methodical structure. At first, she looked at it without comprehension, but as she read further, something subtle changed in her expression. The dates, the adjustments, the repeated cancellations she had not authorized. Her breathing slowed, not in relief, but in realization. "This is not possible," she said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. Vincent remained still. "It is documented," he replied, "and it is consistent." Emily scrolled further, her eyes scanning faster now, searching for something that would contradict what she was seeing. Instead, each entry reinforced the same pattern. Her medical care had been systematically redirected, her access to independent consultation restricted through administrative channels she did not control, and her prescriptions adjusted under authorization she did not recognize. She lowered the tablet slightly, her hand trembling just enough to reveal the strain beneath her composure. "Why would anyone do this?" she asked, not expecting an answer. Vincent's gaze remained steady. "That is what I intend to find out," he said. The simplicity of his response unsettled her more than any speculation could have. For the first time since waking, Emily looked directly at him, truly seeing him not as a stranger in a hospital room, but as someone who had remained when others had not. "You are not family," she said softly, almost as a confirmation of reality rather than a challenge. Vincent did not hesitate. "No," he replied, "but I am now involved." Outside the room, footsteps moved past the door, conversations muted, life continuing in structured rhythm. Inside, Emily sat in silence, absorbing the information in fragments too large to process all at once. Vincent stood slowly, adjusting his coat. "Rest," he said. "You will need clarity when you are stronger." He turned slightly toward the door, then paused just long enough to add, "Nothing about what happened to you was accidental." And with that, he left her alone in the quiet, where the truth had begun to take shape, even if she was not yet ready to understand its full weight. The silence in Emily Carter's hospital room felt different after Vincent Caldwell left, as if the air itself had been reshaped by the weight of what had just been revealed. She sat upright now, the tablet resting loosely in her hands, though she was no longer scrolling. The information displayed on the screen had already moved beyond confusion and into something heavier, something that made her chest tighten in a way she could not immediately name. Financial records, medical logs, authorization trails, each detail aligned into a pattern that suggested her life had been guided rather than lived freely. A soft knock came at the door, and a nurse entered to adjust her forward line, offering a polite smile that did not fully hide her awareness of the situation. "You are stable now," the nurse said gently. "Your body just needs rest and time to recover from prolonged stress." Emily nodded faintly, though her attention drifted back to the screen even after the nurse left. Minutes later, Vincent returned. He did not enter quickly or announce himself. He simply appeared in the doorway and observed her for a moment before stepping inside. His presence carried the same controlled stillness as before, but now there was a subtle shift in his focus, as if something had already been set into motion outside this room. "You have been reading," he said, not as a question but as confirmation. Emily hesitated before responding. "This does not make sense," she admitted quietly. "I never agreed to any of this." Vincent moved closer, stopping near the foot of the bed. "That is the problem," he said. "Agreement was never required in the system you were placed in." She looked up at him, searching his expression for clarity, but found only calm certainty. "Then why was I allowed to get this far?" she asked, her voice steadier now, though still fragile. Vincent paused briefly, as if choosing his words with precision. "Because systems like this do not reveal themselves until they fail," he said. "And yours failed today." Emily lowered the tablet completely now, her grip loosening as if her body was no longer interested in holding onto it. The idea that her collapse had not been random, but a consequence of sustained control, made her feel both exposed and strangely detached, as if she were looking at someone else's life rather than her own. Vincent reached into his coat and placed a thin folder on the nearby table. "This is the full timeline," he said. "Everything I was able to verify within the last 2 hours. It is incomplete, but it is enough to establish intent." Emily did not open it immediately. Instead, she looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. The question was not suspicious. It was simply exhausted. Vincent did not answer right away. When he did, his voice remained steady, but there was something underneath it that had not been present before. "Because someone ensured you would not reach this point without losing control of your own decisions," he said. "And that is not something I ignore." Outside the room, distant footsteps moved through the corridor, life continuing in its ordinary rhythm. Inside, Emily finally reached for the folder, opening it slowly. The first page contained nothing emotional, nothing dramatic, only structured documentation that confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. Her life had not unraveled. It had been redirected. Vincent watched her carefully, not interrupting, not guiding her reaction, allowing the truth to settle at its own pace. When she closed the folder again, her hands were no longer trembling. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Vincent met her gaze directly. "Now," he said, "you stop being managed." And for the first time since waking, Emily did not look away. Emily Carter stood by the hospital window long after Vincent Caldwell had left the room, her reflection faint against the glass, as if she were still trying to understand whether the person staring back at her belonged to the life she remembered. The folder he had given her remained on the bedside table, untouched for several minutes, as though opening it again would make the truth more permanent than she was ready to accept. The steady sound of monitors behind her reminded her that she was still recovering, still physically weak, yet her thoughts had already moved beyond her body's condition. When she finally sat back on the bed, she opened the folder again. This time she did not skim. She read each page slowly, carefully, as if speed might distort reality. The structure was precise, clinical, and undeniable. Dates aligned with symptoms she had ignored. Medical appointments she had attended without question were now shown alongside notes, indicating external approval overrides. Prescriptions she had trusted were listed with annotations that suggested adjustments made without her direct consent. Each page built upon the last, forming a timeline that no longer felt like coincidence but design. Emily closed the folder again, placing it gently on her lap, her hands now still instead of shaking. For a long moment, she simply breathed, trying to separate emotion from comprehension, but there was no separation anymore. A soft knock came at the door, and Vincent Caldwell entered without hesitation. He did not ask how she felt immediately. Instead, he observed her posture, her expression, the way she held the folder, as if it had weight beyond paper. "You have read it," he said calmly. Emily nodded once. "It feels like someone was writing my life without telling me," she said quietly. Vincent stepped closer, stopping at a respectful distance from the bed. "That is an accurate interpretation," he replied, "but it is not irreversible." Emily looked up at him, her expression no longer confused but searching. "What happens to people who did this?" she asked. Vincent did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice remained even, but carried a certainty that made the room feel smaller. "They are identified first," he said. "Then they are removed from influence." Emily studied him carefully, trying to understand whether he meant the words literally or structurally. "And you can do that?" she asked. "Yes," Vincent replied without hesitation. The simplicity of his answer unsettled her more than elaboration would have. She looked away briefly, processing not only the information but the implication that her situation had now moved beyond personal recovery into something larger and more deliberate. Outside the hospital room, the city continued its ordinary rhythm, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place inside a private wing few people had access to. Emily finally set the folder down beside her and exhaled slowly. "I do not know what I am supposed to do next," she admitted. Vincent's gaze softened slightly, though his posture remained unchanged. "You do not have to decide everything immediately," he said. "Right now, your only responsibility is recovery." Emily nodded faintly, but something in her expression suggested that recovery was no longer her only concern. For the first time since waking, she was no longer just a patient in a hospital room, but someone standing at the edge of a truth that had already begun to reshape the direction of her life. The morning light had begun to soften the edges of the hospital room, casting a quiet glow across the polished surfaces as Emily Carter sat upright in bed, no longer overwhelmed by confusion, but held steady by a growing sense of awareness that felt both unsettling and clarifying. The folder Vincent Caldwell had given her remained beside her, now closed, not because she rejected its contents, but because she no longer needed to reread them to believe what it revealed. Her life, once perceived as a sequence of personal choices, now appeared as a carefully managed structure of decisions influenced from outside her awareness. Vincent stood near the window again, observing the city as if it were a network of patterns only he could fully interpret. He had not spoken for several minutes, allowing silence to settle without pressure, until Emily finally broke it herself. "If everything in here is true," she said quietly, her voice steady but no longer fragile, "then I did not lose control of my life yesterday. I was already losing it long before that." Vincent turned slightly toward her, acknowledging the statement without correction. "That is a reasonable conclusion," he said. Emily looked down at her hands, studying them as if they belonged to someone who had only recently begun to reclaim ownership of herself. "What happens now?" she asked again, but this time the question carried a different weight, less about uncertainty and more about direction. Vincent stepped away from the window and approached the bedside slowly, stopping at a distance that respected her space rather than imposing his presence. "Now the structure that controlled your decisions is dismantled," he said calmly. "Quietly, completely, and without further influence on your life." Emily studied him for a long moment, searching not for reassurance, but for clarity. "And you can do that without consequences?" she asked. Vincent did not hesitate. "Consequences exist in every system," he replied. "The difference is whether they affect you or protect you." The answer did not fully resolve her uncertainty, but it grounded something inside her that had been unstable since the collapse. A nurse entered briefly to deliver updated discharge information, noting that Emily's condition had improved enough for monitored release within the next day if recovery continued without complication. After she left, silence returned to the room, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt transitional. Emily finally closed her eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to process. When she opened them again, she looked at Vincent directly. "I do not know who I am supposed to be after this," she said. Vincent regarded her with the same controlled calm he had maintained since the beginning, but there was a subtle shift in his expression now, less analysis, more recognition. "That is not something anyone defines for you anymore," he said. "Not medical systems, not financial systems, and not people who attempted to manage your life without your consent." Emily exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she had been holding for years without realizing it. The hospital room outside their conversation remained unchanged, but within it, the dynamic had shifted permanently. She was no longer a passive subject of observation or treatment. She was present, aware, and beginning to understand the extent of her own autonomy. Vincent stepped back slightly, preparing to leave the room. Before he reached the door, he paused and added one final statement. Without turning around. "When you leave here," he said, "you will not be returning to the same world you collapsed in." Then he exited quietly, leaving Emily alone, not in uncertainty, but in the first moment of choice she had truly recognized as her own.